Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us in the Synthetic Intelligence Forum. My name is Vic, and I'm the founder and the host of the forum. It's my pleasure to be joined today by Professor Anders Knudby. Professor Knudby is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics in the University of Ottawa. Today, he's going to talk to us about AI in Earth observation. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Knudby. It's a pleasure to have you in the forum and really excited to hear from you about AI and Earth observation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vic. As you can see on the slide here, the title of my talk is AI in Earth Observation. My name is Anders Knudby. I'm an associate professor in geography at the University of Ottawa. And I also run a small company called Liquid Geomatics. Today, I'll talk about how AI is used in Earth observation, which immediately raises two questions. What is AI and what is Earth observation? So let's just get started with AI. Here's a classic definition of both AI, machine learning, and deep learning, what they mean and how they relate to each other. Using these definitions here, all of what I'm going to talk about today qualifies not only as AI, but also as machine learning. And some of the applications I'm going to describe later, they also qualify as deep learning. So it's the definition of machine learning that's most important here. And if you read it, I think you'll agree that it's maybe a bit vague. It's always a red flag when there's quotation marks in a definition, I guess. But you probably get the idea, which is that we can use data to train some kind of model to make predictions. And also, and this is important here, the detailed prior specification of the structure of this model is not required because the machine is going to figure that out based on the data. What that model looks like and what it's used for, we'll get back to that a bit later. Now about Earth observation, it's really quite a simple concept. You take your favorite instrument, like a camera, you attach it to a satellite, you put the satellite in orbit, and you make sure the instrument is pointed down toward Earth. And then you just start recording and streaming the data down to Earth, along with information about where the satellite is and which way it's pointing. So here's a nice illustration from ESA of how that works, showing how the two Sentinel-2 satellites that are in orbit right now collect imagery from a swath under their orbital path, and as the Earth rotates, the location of that path changes, and after a while, as you see here, the satellites have combined to collect data from the entire Earth's surface. Now, the Sentinel-2 satellites that this illustration highlights, they carry optical sensors and create what we would normally think of as satellite images. But it's important to keep in mind we can put all kinds of other instruments on satellites as well, like radars, lidars, thermal imagers, gravity meters, microwave instruments, any instrument really that you can think of other than acoustics, we can put them on satellites and use them to collect data about Earth. Now, a bit more context to explain why we're talking about AI and Earth observation today. When I first learned about satellite data in university, my undergrad thesis was based on using two Landsat images taken of a glacier in Greenland 15 years apart. And I used those images, I compared surface features that I could recognize in both images, and I compared their locations to find out how quickly the glacier had been moving, specifically the glacier surface had been moving in that 15-year period. And that was a pretty common approach at the time because imagery was costly and there wasn't a lot of it. But times have really changed. This graph shows the number of satellites that are in orbit around Earth and how it has changed since Sputnik first went up in 1957. Now, the numbers you see here, they're not for Earth observation satellites, they're for all satellites. And most of these satellites are not for Earth observation, but many of them are. In fact, there are more than 1,000 Earth observation satellites in orbit right now. And the trend is the same as what we see here in the slide for all the satellites. And the sheer volume of satellites that are in orbit isn't the whole story either. The first civilian Earth observation satellite, Landsat 1, would acquire images with a pixel size of 68 by 83 meters, using 4 separate image bands, each of which registered data at a 6-bit resolution. So that sounded pretty technical, but what it means is that for every 68 by 83 meter area on the Earth's surface, Landsat 8 would record a total of 24 bits of information. The image shown here is an example of that kind of data. It was acquired by Landsat 1. Despite what seems like pretty antiquated technology by today's standards, we have to keep in mind that Landsat 1 images contain millions of pixels. So millions of these 24 bits were acquired each time Landsat 1 took an image. In comparison, one of the most advanced satellites today, which is Digital Globe's WorldView 3, they have other WorldView satellites, it acquires data from one band with a pixel size of 30 by 30 centimeters, not meters, but centimeters. It has another 8 bands that are acquiring data with a pixel size of 1.25 by 1.25 meter, another 8 bands that use 4 by 4 meter pixels, and another 12 bands that use 30 by 30 meter pixels. And each of those bands, they collect data either in 11 or 14 bits of information per pixel. So what this means is that when WorldView 3 images the same area that a Landsat 1 satellite collected 24 bits of information for, WorldView 3 collects a little over 1 million bits of data. So about 40,000 times as much information for the same imaged area. That kind of technology allows us to acquire images like this one that you might recognize from the news a while back. That puts Earth observation firmly within the realm of what I would normally call, what most people would call big data. And I don't think I'm offending anybody if I say that we've gotten really, really good, as humanity has gotten really, really good at acquiring lots and lots of imagery from satellites. We've gotten much less good at turning all of this imagery into information and knowledge. And this is obviously where AI comes in, along with other technologies like cloud computing, because they allow us to analyze vast amounts of data that are available without necessarily feeling like this poor girl in the process. I don't want to spend a long time on cloud-based satellite image analysis, but the massive amounts of data begging to be turned into useful information does leave us with two rather big challenges. First, we need people to be able to reach the data. And second, those people need to have the tools to analyze it. The first challenge is not trivial because there's terabytes of data being created daily, and it's just unimaginable that people like myself would download all of that before we can start to analyze it. Thankfully, cloud-based satellite image processing platforms allow us to access data where they exist, which is typically on servers hosted by private companies. So I'll show a quick example here of how that can work, and I'm going to show it with Google Earth Engine. Microsoft and Amazon both have their own similar platforms, and this is not a particular endorsement of Google, but Google was first in this space, and their platform is most used, and it's the one I'm personally most familiar with, so that's why I'm using that. Anyone with a Google account can actually try this for themselves as well. So here I'll show you a little example of how you can access Google Earth Engine through a Python-based notebook in Google Colab. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to build a composite image out of a bunch of different Sentinel-2 satellite images. The problem with many satellite images, optical images, is that they have clouds covering parts of the Earth's surface. So you can't see through the clouds, which means you can't analyze any changes or states of the Earth's surface under the clouds. So what you typically need to do is you need to combine the cloud-free parts of different images into one composite image, which you can then analyze. A simple way to do this is that you try to look at multiple images and pick one of the darkest pixels to be a representation of the Earth's surface during the time period that you're interested in. And that works pretty well over land because clouds tend to be brighter than other things that you would find on land. So if you pick a dark pixel, it's probably not a cloudy one. There's better ways to do it over land, actually, but it makes even more sense over water, where there's a bunch of other things like ice, whitecaps, ships, and so on, all of which tend to make the water brighter looking than it would be if those effects weren't there. So if you want to find just good, clean, cloud-free water in a satellite image, you want to look for a dark pixel. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now there's a couple of different ways to access data in Google Earth Engine. I'm using this approach. There's others, just to keep that in mind. So the first thing we have to do is we have to import some functions, some Python libraries, etc. I've already done that here because it's kind of boring. And then we have to just access Earth Engine with our Google account, which I've also already done. It's not complicated, it's just not interesting to see either. Then now we get to the fun part here. So you'll notice that the code is actually quite simple. What I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to look at Earth Engine image collection called Copernicus Sentinel-2 Surface Reflectance Harmonized Image Collection. So I'm just saying this is the data that I want to work with. Run that, and this runs really, really quickly because I'm not downloading anything, I'm not doing any analysis, I'm just saying these are the data I want to work with. Then I'm going to create an area of interest for my study, which in this case is a relatively small area just around the southern tip of Corsica in France. And if I want to make sure that I didn't mess that up and I picked the right area, I can put it on a map, which uses Google Maps as the background. And this is rather zoomed out, but if we zoom in here, you'll see that, in fact, I did end up with a rectangle that covers the southern tip of Corsica. So that's good. Now what we want to do is we want to say, well, we don't want to use all images taken by Sentinel-2 ever, anywhere. So we need to kind of whittle down the image collection so that we can deal with a smaller number of images that are more relevant to our study. And Google Earth Engine provides some good tools for doing this. Here they have one called filter date. So you can set a start date and an end date and say, I want to use only the images that are within this time period. I haven't been very restrictive here because the first Sentinel-2 satellite wasn't launched until 2015, and we're not long after this date here, 31st of January 2023. So I'm essentially just excluding the very, very latest Sentinel-2 imagery here. But you could set stricter dates if you wanted to. You can also filter data, as I'm doing here, by what's called calendar range. So in this case, I'm saying I want to work only with the months from 6 to 8. So essentially from June, July, and August. All the fall, winter, and spring imagery, I don't want to work with. So that excludes quite a lot. And then, of course, the big one is here I'm saying I only want to work with the imagery that covers my study area. So that excludes most of the imagery for the rest of the world. And then once I've done all of that narrowing down of what imagery I actually want to work with, I then take each image and I apply a cloud mask that I've made myself to it. So that's just an attempt to get rid of the most obvious clouds in the imagery. And if we run this, again, it's very, very fast because all I'm doing really is I'm narrowing down the imagery I want to work with, and then I'm cloud masking it. And cloud masking it isn't a small task, but because it runs on Google servers, and I haven't asked Google for any feedback yet, or any results to be sent to me yet. It's actually not doing it yet. Google is just recording that, okay, this guy wants us to mask his clouds in this image, but they haven't actually done it yet. They just kind of aware that this needs to happen at some point. Now, if I look at, instead of all Sentinel-2 imagery ever created, how much is left in my collection that I'm actually going to work with? And if I run that, I can see that it says there's 801 images left that match my criteria, right? They're from June, July, or August. They cover my study area, and they're not the very latest imagery. So that's still quite a lot of imagery. And I'm certainly happy that I don't have to download this because each Sentinel-2 image is approximately 1 gigabyte in size. So that's a lot of stuff to download. My internet connection here is not that great. Then down here, I'm saying, based on this filtered image collection, I want to access the first 5 bands of Sentinel imagery. These are the visible bands, and a little bit into the near infrared spectrum. And then I want to, for each pixel that is covered in my study area, I want to look at all the different observations of that pixel, except for those that were masked out as being cloud. And I want to take the 10th percentile reflectance value and save that and use that in my composite image. So I'm essentially saying I want not the very darkest pixel, because the very darkest pixel is likely to be in the shadow of a cloud. Not under a cloud, but in the shadow of one. And that's not the kind of pixels that I want to work with. I want nice clear sky pixels. I don't want the very, very darkest, because they're likely to be that kind of pixel, but I want sort of close to it. So I'm just setting the 10th percentile here. And then, of course, I want to clip the output just to cover my study area. So if I do that here, again, this runs really quickly because, again, I haven't actually asked Google to send me anything yet. I'm just telling it what I want done. Now I'm going to run this one here. Now I'm asking Google to then show me what that would look like. So this requires them to actually do this stuff that I asked them to do up here, which is why it can be a little slow to actually get the output, because now they have to do stuff on Google servers and they have to send it to me over, again, an internet connection that's not too fast. But we can see something is starting to appear here, and it looks pretty reasonable. There we go. This is actually my whole study area. And if we zoom in, we can see that the quality of the imagery is not great right now, but that's because Google hasn't sent me the full results yet. They're only doing the processing that's necessary to show me what I'm asking for. As I'm zooming in, I'm essentially asking for more and more detail, so they have to do more and more of the processing. But you can see already now the results for the areas that have been processed look a little sharper. And if we wait a bit longer, this one here is gonna come to. But sometimes it's a little jerky in how fast things arrive there. Here we go. But if I zoom out a little bit again, you can see that this area is actually, it looks very nice. It's totally cloud-free, no white caps, no ships, no airplanes, no fog, because all of that has been removed by the process. And what I'm left with here is a single image that is of much higher quality and much easier to analyze. It's going to give you much better results than any individual image that I could have found of this study area. Again, it looks kind of funky right now because it's still kind of slowly trying to send me all of the information that I have asked for. Now, in the end, what I can do is I can hook up to my Google Drive here, and I can export the result to my Google Drive, so I can have it on my own computer and do any further analysis with it if I need to. So this is just one example of how to access large volumes of imagery, right? 800 gigabytes in this example, without actually having to download it. And this is absolutely fundamental for our ability to make use of all this satellite imagery that's available. The other thing is to have good tools to analyze the imagery. What I've done here is relatively simple. I've just created a composite image. Google Earth Engine provides some tools for more advanced analysis of the imagery, but I believe that this is still a relatively speaking, a weak point, not just for Google Earth Engine, but for our ability in general to analyze these enormous volumes of data that we create constantly.
So the next challenge, as I mentioned in that little video, once we've accessed the imagery, is to turn it from imagery into information. And given that broad definition of AI I mentioned earlier, the entire history of Earth observation processing is a history of AI. Because ever since the launch of the first imaging satellite, we've tried to teach computers to analyze images that they created and identify objects or detect change or classify different parts of the Earth's surface. But I think the most interesting recent developments in that field, and the ones that most people would label as AI, it's the application of non-parametric machine learning algorithms. Most recently, the emergence of convolutional neural networks. So that's what I'll focus on in the rest of my talk here, and I'll use some examples done in my own lab, not because we're the do the best or most exciting research in the world, but because I know it very well and because it actually contains some good examples of what AI is and how it's being used in Earth observation. So I'll start with some work that I did when I was a PhD student back in the mid-2000s. And I apologize, we're gonna take a bit of a tangent and dive a little bit into fish ecology here. But bear with me, I think it's a useful place to start to illustrate how machine learning works and why it works well and better than other methods. For my PhD research, I was using high-resolution satellite imagery that you can see here on the left to map various aspects of water depth and seafloor habitat for a coral reef in Zanzibar. The resulting maps that are shown on this 6 images in the middle here, they were actually just an intermediate step, because what I was really interested in was how the environment on that reef and around that island would shape the distribution of fish biodiversity on the reef. So to figure that out, I also surveyed the fish population, and then I created some predictive models that allowed me to formalize the relationship between environment and fish diversity, and thereby indirectly map the fish diversity by applying that model to my intermediate maps there. So for example, it became clear that areas with high local variability in water depth also have high fish diversity, which makes sense because those areas can accommodate both the fish that like shallow water and the fish that like deep water. Similarly, areas with a good amount of healthy coral tended to have greater fish diversity than other areas. And because I could map both variability in water depth and coral cover, I could indirectly map the fish diversity. But the relationship between coral cover and fish diversity is an interesting one. An absence of coral causes low fish diversity in an area because all those fish species that need the coral to hide from predators, they obviously don't like areas without coral. But too much coral can also be bad for diversity because some fish species rely on algae for food. And when there's coral everywhere, the algae has no place to grow. So the optimal amount of coral cover, if you want to optimize fish diversity, is somewhere in the middle. The figure here, it illustrates that relationship, and it's made up. These are not real data, but it's inspired by a paper I read during my PhD that kind of really got me going onto the machine learning path. So think of it as a generic figure that depicts a true relationship between two variables that can be discerned by the shape of the points, not the line, just the shape of the point cloud here. The red line illustrates what the relationship would be modeled as if someone was to use a linear regression model to analyze it. And this is the assumption of linearity may sound silly because most things in nature aren't obviously linear, but it's also incredibly common in science to assume that things are linearly related, regardless actually of whether you have a strong idea of what the actual relationship looks like or not. So the point of this figure is that real relationships are complex, and the one illustrated here is actually an extremely simplistic one because it only considers a single variable that influences fish diversity. In reality, fish diversity is determined by complex interactions between habitat, currents, prey, and predators, and of course the human impacts in terms of fishing and things like sedimentation, nutrient enrichment, and so on. To model complex relationships between variables, especially when we don't have an a priori idea of what those relationships look like, we need to go beyond linear models. And this is where AI and specifically machine learning, they come in. So for my PhD work, I tested a bunch of different models, as many others have done in their respective fields. And I've come to the conclusion that a model type called random forest is usually a good default model to use. So in all the tests I've done myself, and most of the ones I've read about, it always performs at or near the top. So I'll try to explain how it works. Let's say you have 100 data points, and each data point contains information about fish diversity. You see that here on the left. And also habitat information like water depth, coral cover, and rugosity, which is a measure of the structural complexity of the seafloor. So you can imagine you've been out on the reef and you've measured the fish diversity, and the same location measured the other variables here. So your data set would look something like this. The random forest model proceeds by splitting the data into two subsets based on a threshold value applied to one of the variables. So for example, if we put all the data points with depth greater than 2 meters into one group, and all those with depth less or equal to 2 meters into the other group, we get something like this. We then calculate the variance of fish diversity in each of the two subsets here, with the idea being that good subsets are homogeneous and therefore have low variance. So now we have a threshold, depth more or less than 2 meters, and an associated value of homogeneity in the two subsets. We then proceed to test every possible threshold that can be applied to the data based on every possible variable other than fish diversity itself. And we calculate the homogeneity of the data sets or the subsets that result from applying those thresholds. And we pick the best one, the one that created the most homogeneous subsets of data. In this example, it turns out that a really good threshold to use is whether rugosity is greater than 1.235 or not, because that creates subsets with high fish diversity where there's high rugosity and vice versa. Graphically, we could show something like this here in what we call a decision tree. We then proceed to find the threshold that best splits subset 1 into two smaller subsets. Here I've called them subset 1.1 and 1.2. Maybe this time it's based on coral cover. And this already illustrates an important strength of models based on decision trees, because coral cover may be important for fish diversity in areas with high rugosity, as in this example, but not important in areas with low rugosity. This is called an interaction effect, where the rugosity determines whether coral cover is important or not. And normal regression models can't take such effects into account. We do the same for subset number 2, and so on. We're splitting subset 1.1 and subset 1.2 and subset 2.1 and subset 2.2 and so on, until some criterion tells the algorithm to stop. This can be based on how small the subsets are now, or what homogeneity we have achieved, or just how many splits we have been doing with each subset. When the tree is complete, we calculate the mean value of the remaining data points in each subset. So in the future, when we use the tree for prediction, the mean value will become the prediction for any data point that landed in that subset. So for example, if you have a pixel in the image with high rugosity and high coral cover goes into subset 1.1, you would estimate that the fish diversity index for that pixel is 2.7. But that's just one decision tree. Most random forest models use hundreds, if not thousands, of decision trees together. Each tree is created on purpose to be slightly different by constructing it using only a random subset of the data and also just a random subset of the available variables. So that makes sure that each tree is slightly different, which turns out to be an important strength of this kind of model. Once all the trees in the forest have been created, we take a new set of observations and apply the thresholds to get a prediction from each tree. And then we simply calculate the mean value of the predictions from each tree as our final prediction, what I've called the mean prediction here. So following my coral reef research example, each of the pixels in my map contain a value of water depth and a value of coral cover and a value of rugosity that I derived from the satellite image. We then run those values through the trees to get a prediction of what the likely fish diversity would be in each pixel. That's how we create the map of fish diversity. So that's how the random forest machine learning model works, and that's how I made the maps of fish diversity using satellite imagery. So the random forest model has a couple of important strengths over simpler regression models. First of all, the user doesn't have to make an assumption about the nature of the relationship. Is it linear, exponential, or third-degree polynomial, or something? We don't often know, and we don't really want to make an assumption about the nature of that relationship if we don't know or have any good idea what it might actually be. The thing is, in nature, many relationships aren't any of those things. Any of those that I just mentioned. But the random forest model can model whatever kind of relationship exists in reality because it just fits that relationship to the data that it's fed. That's a really important strength. These relationships, again, can also include threshold effects, where a relationship changes suddenly and drastically beyond a certain value. This is very hard for other types of regression models to do. And those kinds of threshold effects, they might be rare in nature, but they do actually occur. So you could imagine, for example, in this area, there's a lot of local fishermen. And let's just imagine that their local fishing gear reaches down to a depth of about 7 meters. What that would mean is that deeper than 7 meters, fish populations are left largely alone, so diversity would be high. But above 7 meters, most fish are gone because they've been either caught or they've escaped to deeper waters. None of the traditional regression models would be able to adequately quantify a relationship like that, but the random forest can do it easily, because you'd probably see a split in one of those models based on depth greater than or less than 7 meters. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the random forest can use interaction effects, where one variable influences the relationship between two other variables. So for example, the coral cover may be important at depths shallower than 7 meters, because if fishermen keep their nets away from corals, they don't want them entangled. But it might be less important at deeper depths. I just want to make it clear that random forest is not the only predictive model available to do this kind of work. There's tens, if not hundreds, of machine learning models, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. And new models continue to be developed all of the time. I just wanted to explain random forest in a bit of detail because I've used it a lot and because it's generally so good at making predictions. So here's some other examples of work that I've done or that other people have in my lab have done that also relies on machine learning models. The first one is an example of what we call satellite-derived bathymetry, in which we take a satellite image and we try to estimate for each pixel how deep the water is. So this is an example of actually from that study area in southern Corsica that I showed earlier on the video. On the left, you see the general outline of the area, and then in the middle you see a zoomed in version of the area on the left where you see the little black box. And this particular random forest model was used to estimate the water depth based on the reflection of essentially the color in the middle image for each pixel. Machine learning obviously isn't limited to looking at water, though, although that happens to be my primary expertise. It can also be applied to map basically anything that you can acquire imagery of from space. So in another study shown here, we used nighttime imagery from the International Space Station, which you see on the left here, depicting Ottawa and its surroundings at night. So we used this imagery to map the ambient light observed by a pedestrian at night. The nighttime light environment has all kinds of influences on people. It can disrupt your sleep if it's too bright and too white, if you have an LED bulb shining at you. Or it can make people feel safer in their neighborhood if there's good lighting, which makes people go out more at night, get more exercise, leading to better health or maybe better social cohesion within the neighborhood, and so on. Understanding the light that people are exposed to in their environment is involved in all kinds of research, and space-based data turn out to be one of the best sources for this information. It turns out that you can also indirectly map soil using this kind of approach in a process normally called digital soil mapping. So here in this example, we mostly used terrain data from a digital elevation model. We compared a bunch of different machine learning models to assess how good they were at accurately mapping soil types in the part of BC. One of my PhD students used a machine learning approach to map how hot it gets in different parts of Vancouver. Satellites are really good at measuring surface temperature, which is the temperature you would feel painfully if you walk barefoot across a parking lot on a hot summer day. But people are more impacted, at least their health is more impacted by the temperature of the air, because that's what we breathe and it's what's next to our skin when we're out and about. But satellites can't really measure air temperature. So my student created a machine learning model that used information that we can map, namely surface temperature, vegetation density, elevation, proximity to the ocean, and here also the three-dimensional structure of the built environment, to make predictions of the air temperature that we can't map directly. And here we see the resulting map, which is now used by health professionals in Vancouver to identify areas that are most at risk when there's a heat wave. And they do actually get heat waves in Vancouver. This work was inspired by a heat wave that was estimated to have cost more than 100 deaths. So figuring out where the relatively speaking, warmer areas are in the city and where the relatively speaking, cooler areas are in the city can help identify the people that are at risk the next time we see another heat wave. We can use a very similar approach to map air quality. In this case, it's the concentration of PM 2.5, which is a very fine particulate matter suspended in the air, less than 2.5 microns in diameter. And this is a map we made for all of BC using the same kind of approach. The last example I want to mention for now is a project I work on with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, where we use data on seafloor structure, currents, ocean temperature, and productivity to map likely aggregations of large deep sea sponges along the east coast in the area you see here. These sponges are one of the few things that create structure on the seafloor in this region. Where there's no sponges, it tends to be very flat. Because they do that, they also substantially increase local biodiversity, kind of like the coral. You have fish that like to go and hide near the sponges. So mapping out where the sponges are helps our government protect these areas from the worst effects of deep sea fishing. One thing that's worth mentioning is that in the previous examples, the predictions of ambient light or air temperature or PM 2.5 or whatever, they were all based on data from the exact pixel that the prediction was made for. And this is sometimes rather intuitive. A bright area can indicate a sandy soil, and it doesn't really matter if the neighboring area is dark or not. But it's not always ideal to ignore that neighboring area, because while a hot surface likely means that the air above it is also hot, air moves around. And it's also influenced by the surface area in the area that it came from, the upwind area. We know this intuitively because winds coming from the north tend to be cold, and vice versa, at least where I live. So looking just at the individual pixel, it ignores a kind of spatial context, which we shouldn't always ignore. And it's always the spatial context is also often an important piece of the information that humans use to interpret imagery that we're looking at. So the image here is hard to make sense of. For example, although a detailed analysis might reveal it to be asphalt if we had looked at the spectrum for it. But if we look at the full picture, there we go. Then we can take the larger context into consideration. Now we know that it's not just asphalt, but it's part of a runway. That's a pretty big difference in our understanding of what this could mean, the way we can use the information that's in the image. And there's a new class, super new, but relatively new class of AI models that are designed to make use of the spatial context for image interpretation. Models that should be able to figure out, in fact, that what's in that red box here is part of a runway and not just a rectangular piece of asphalt. So these models are called convolutional neural networks, or CNNs, and they are what a lot of people are thinking of as AI when they talk about image interpretation. So I'll make an attempt to explain how they work, and then I'll show you some examples of what we've done in our lab. CNNs are ridiculously complex, and so this is a very simplistic introduction. I apologize, but it's beyond my capability to explain in detail actually how CNNs work. Maybe it's beyond anybody's capability to explain in detail. CNNs, they take images as input data. So in our case, we use satellite images, and then they apply a series of filters to these images to highlight spatial structures that could exist in the image. It can apply many different filters. It can do this at multiple scales. And then it can relate the filtered images back to the presence or absence of features in the image. So for example, on the left, here's an image of a dog. We can apply a smoothing filter to blur the image, which we can do by calculating the mean brightness value for each pixel and its 8 neighbors, and then writing that mean value back into each pixel. So if we do that for all the pixels in the image, we get a smoothing effect as shown here on the right. So this is a typical smoothing filter, and this is part of most CNN models. Alternatively, we can use a different filter. We can, instead of calculating the average of a 3x3 window, we can calculate 5 times the brightness of the pixel itself, and then subtract the values from its 4 neighbors. And if we do that and apply it to the entire image, we get something that looks like what I'm showing on the right here. So this is called a sharpening filter, and it does make the image look a little bit sharper, but it also does other things to the image that isn't visually pleasing, but can be useful in terms of interpretation of what is in the image. So both of those filters leave us with an image that looked more or less similar to the original one. But we can also apply, for example, edge detection filters that leave us with something quite different as a result. As is suggested by the names, edge detection filters highlight edges in the image, which are areas where the brightness or color changes quickly over a short distance. So here's an example. I don't know how well this shows, but you can see sort of a bright line that seems to run around the edge of the dog. All these filters, smoothing, sharpening, edge detection, and a bunch of other filters that we haven't talked about, they can be applied to each of the color bands individually. So we could, for example, apply a smoothing filter to the red band, a sharpening filter to the green band, and a filter of a different size and purpose to the blue band. The resulting images can also be combined in different ways, and filters can be applied to those images as well. So we're applying filters to the filtered images. This is where it gets pretty hairy and difficult for human beings to actually understand what the content of each resulting image is. But the general idea is that some filters will extract information that helps identify the thing that exists in each pixel in the image. And CNNs, and this is the important part that makes them really good, CNNs can learn on their own which filters provide useful information for a given task and which don't. So for example, maybe edge filters work well with images of short-haired dogs because the contrast between a dog that has short hair and the background would be quite sharp. But maybe they work less well with long-haired dogs because, as is the case here, that line is kind of blurred a little bit by the semi-permeability of the edge of the dog. I don't know. It's just an example. Some filters work well with some images, not so well with others. But the point is that the CNNs can try out all these different filters and essentially see which ones are good at telling me where the dog is in the image and which ones are not so good. So I'm going to show a couple of examples of where we have used CNNs in my lab. So that image I showed earlier, where we used the random forest model to map water depth for this part of southern Corsica, that was part of a study that actually found that the CNN model was better than the random forest model at doing this. So this image here shows the example where we're looking at some sandy seafloor in the black oval. You see that on the left. And the random forest model happens to underestimate the depth of this sandy seafloor a bit. The CNN model doesn't. So it's unclear why the CNN model does better, but we suspect that its ability to make prediction based on information not just from the individual pixel, but also from pixels around it in the immediate neighborhood is a distinct advantage, and is the reason why it performs better in this case here. In another project, one of my students has developed a model to map lichen, which is an important food for woodland caribou, which is a species listed under the Species at Risk Act in Canada. So he cleverly names his model lichen, L-I-C-N-N, because that's the kind of model it is. It is a CNN model. So the model uses the color of lichen, which is distinct. You see it here in the pale gray, I would call it. It's distinct from the flowering plants and soil that are around it, but the model also uses the texture of lichen to distinguish it from other things that could be on the surface. As you can see here, in this example, the model works quite well. The light-colored lichen on the image on the left is mostly correctly classified as lichen with a turquoise color in the image on the right. I just felt obliged to also show you this image to show that CNNs aren't magical and sometimes they make mistakes. The dead branches in this image on the left here, they have a color that's quite similar to the lichen that you can also see in the image, but their shape and texture are quite different. So CNNs should be good at differentiating the two. But as you can see here in the image on the right, the large branch on the left side of the image was incorrectly classified as being lichen. Some of the smaller branches, you'll notice, were correctly classified as not being lichen. So it wasn't all bad, but it does illustrate the limits of this particular CNN model and of CNN models in general. Changing pace a bit, a student in my lab has used CNNs to map thaw slumps. So for those not familiar with thaw slumps, here's a super quick primer. When permafrost, which is frozen ground, thaws in areas like the Canadian North, the ice in the permafrost turns to water. And when that happens, the soil that had been frozen, it loses some of the structural support that the ice in it provided. So if that surface is not level, and this can cause the now unfrozen soil to kind of collapse and then move downslope. When that happens, it leaves the new, still frozen soil exposed to air, which is a situation that you can see here. That exposed soil, because it's exposed to the air, then it will also thaw more quickly than it would otherwise, and it can collapse and expose the soil behind it to the air. And so on, causing sort of a landform that sort of eats its way upslope as the permafrost thaws. Mapping these thaw slumps, it's a scientific priority because they're an indication of climate change. And it's also just a practical concern because they threaten infrastructure. You can imagine if you have a town or a road or a railroad upslope from this thing here, that would be a concern. But also because the soil itself tends to flow into lakes and rivers, and it changes the local hydrology, and it changes the water quality of the water bodies that it flows into. So when you look at these things in false color satellite imagery, they can look something like this here. The active thaw slumps, the ones that are still eating their way upslope, they have a bright core and a rounded edge upslope. The stable ones, the ones that are no longer moving, that they have the same kind of rounded edge going upslope, but their core is darker because vegetation has now become able to grow there. And as it turns out, CNNs are really good at finding thaw slumps because they have a characteristic shape, as seen in this image here. Because we can do this with satellites that have extremely good coverage, also in the Arctic, we can track the development of new thaw slumps, and we can track the activity of existing ones. And we can do this across the Canadian Arctic, which is a task that's just unfeasible, obviously without Earth observation data, without satellite imagery, but also without the AI tools that we need to find these things in imagery. Of course, you can imagine people looking at these images and saying, yes, there's a thaw slump and there's a thaw slump. It's much less feasible to have a person looking at the thousands of images that are taken each day and doing this than it is to have a machine do it. My last example for today is based on the work of one of my PhD students. It focuses on detection of the North Atlantic right whale, which is critically endangered. There's currently less than 400 individuals in the world of this particular species. If we want to save this species, we need to do everything we can to limit how often these whales get caught in fishing gear or struck by ships, which is two of the major causes of death. But this is tricky because the whale migrates along the east coast of North America, where there's lots of fishing and lots of shipping happening all the time. It's east coast of North America is really not a great place to live if you're a whale. So the approach in both the US and Canada is to detect the whales quickly and efficiently, and then limit or stop the dangerous human activity in the areas where the whales are found, when they are found there. So we're contributing to this by developing a CNN model that will automatically detect these whales in high-resolution satellite imagery. The image here at the bottom of the slide, it shows you a North Atlantic right whale photographed from an airplane. And above, you can see 8 examples of what such whales look like in a satellite image. Right whales thankfully have that bright band on the top of their head, which is very helpful, but still it's quite challenging because most of the whale is typically underwater when it's imaged by the satellite. And its color isn't that different from that of the water itself. That's illustrated in all of these images here. But also there isn't much else in the ocean that looks like a whale. So the model actually tends to work quite well. So I know I've relied a lot on work in my own lab for this talk, but AI is obviously being used for Earth observation all over the world, where it powers automated image processing and lets us gain insights into what's going on Earth. Satellites are really unique in their ability to gather information about the Earth quickly, at enormous volume and at low cost, and including for areas that are far away from human habitation. So the firehose of information that satellites provide us with requires AI to make sense of, to actually learn from, so we can use the information to make better decisions. And when a new crack appears in an ice shelf in Antarctica, or when firefighters need to plan how to fight wildfires in California, or when climate change changes where phytoplankton grows in the ocean, it's largely AI-powered interpretation of satellite imagery that helps us understand what's going on and how we can best respond to it. So that's the end of my talk. I will be happy to take some questions and talk more about AI and Earth observation.
Thank you, Anders, for a fantastic talk. It was a pleasure to hear you discuss these very important topics. So I have two questions that come to mind. I'll ask them and you can answer them. Let's go one at a time. So the first question that comes to mind, Anders, is that, you talked about the power of artificial intelligence, specifically machine learning, from an image analysis, image interpretation, image inference perspective, which certainly you used a number of interesting use cases to demonstrate that. I want to now maybe talk about a situation where the outputs of these types of models are themselves inputs into downstream models. So for instance, if we have a physics-based model, or even if we have another machine learning model that is used for simulation. So let's say you want to simulate the spread of flood water or groundwater, or you want to simulate some type of forest fires or wildland fires. Now, have you seen those types of collaborations happening, or those types of integrations happening, where AI for image interpretation or satellite image analysis, then the features or the outputs of that extractions are then fed into as features into these downstream models, which could be simulation models or digital twin models and systems of that nature?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is a little bit, I'd say, outside of my area of expertise, but I'll try to answer the question as best I can. One of the ways in which this is done is with maps of water quality that is produced with satellite data. So these can be used in combination with hydrological models and meteorological models, to not only to map harmful algae that can occur on our beaches, for example, but also to predict where they might occur in the future. The same thing can happen with coral reefs when we have imagery. This now I'm not talking about the typical satellite imagery, but as I mentioned early on in the talk, you can also put thermal imagers on satellites to map the temperature of the Earth. So we do that, and we can detect when water is getting close to or above the temperature threshold that is critical for corals. If the water gets too hot, the corals bleach and eventually die. And those maps, they feed into, again, oceanic circulation models that can then predict not only right now where are corals in danger of bleaching and dying, but where will they be in danger of bleaching and dying in the near future. So I think those are probably two examples that I'm familiar with of the kind of feeding into downstream models that I'm most familiar with.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you, Anders. And one last question that comes to mind is, you talked about sort of the deluge, or you talked about just the sort of saturation of data that are out there. You talked about how there's all these satellites that are orbiting the Earth, and in different bands and different spectra, they're capturing at different resolutions, etc., various different aspects of the globe. The question then comes up, which is that how do you sort of go from that kind of unlabeled or unsupervised data to labeled data? Because for a lot of the trainings that you referred to, you require supervised learning techniques. So are there good labeled data sets available for the kind of analysis that you and your team do?
For some things there are. So one of the applications of Earth observation that's very mature, I would say, is land cover mapping. So we can quite comfortably look at a pixel or a local area in a satellite image and give it a label as to what kind of surface are we looking at. The simplest one would be just, are we looking at water or are we looking at land? Is that land snow covered or is it not snow covered? But we can go into much more detail than that. What kind of vegetation is on that land, for example? And that we can do quite comfortably without any local calibration of the algorithm. That just happens, and this happens. I'm not personally involved in this kind of work, but this happens on a regular basis and allows us to detect changes on the Earth's surface basically as soon as they're imaged. And this is partly because the way a certain surface type looks in a satellite image is rather well defined. There are other things that are also relatively easy to spot quickly. So for example, if we have an oil spill somewhere, the oil will, at least part of the oil will tend to float up onto the surface, making the surface of the water very smooth. And especially radar satellites are really good at looking at the sort of the fine scale structure of a surface. So smooth ocean water versus not so smooth is a rather easy difference to detect, and it can be done automatically. So yeah, there's a lot of things that are already happening along the lines of what you were asking, and it's also, I would say, sort of the holy grail of most of the applications that both me and my students and a lot of other people do. We all want things to be increasingly automatable, if that's a word. But sometimes it's hard, and sometimes it just requires more research, and sometimes it's already done.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting to know. So with that, Anders, it brings us to the close of our session today. I really appreciate your taking the time to come and speak with us. And since the field is advancing and progressing so quickly with new developments, new growth coming at us very rapidly, we'd love to have you back in a couple of months to share some updates from your research lab, but also more broadly from the research ecosystem and the community that's looking at AI in Earth observation. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.